Now, Pastor Jason, last time you spoke to us about how morality points towards God's existence.
Yep, that's right, Nellis. Last time we talked about objective, universal morality, that it points to God's existence. But the feature we'll be talking about today, Nellis, is the fact that our universe had a beginning. Many people today try to mistakenly think that the universe has been here forever, it's existed eternally, but we'll discover today that is not really the case. Listeners, I want you to try to remember these 19 words and commit them to your memory. This is a very powerful and effective tool to point someone to the reality of God's existence. Here's the 19 words I'd like you to memorize. Now, John 3:16 has 25 words, and these 19 words are even easier for you to commit to your memory. Here we go. Step number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number 2, the universe began to exist. Step number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Those 19 words uses the fact that the universe had a beginning to show us that the universe also needs a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. So Nellis, what we want to do with our listeners now is simply examine each one of these premises, each one of the steps of the argument, and simply try to find out if it makes more sense to believe it than not. Remember, listeners, we are not trying to aim for 100% mathematical certainty, simply trying to aim for presenting an argument that it makes more sense to believe it than to believe the opposite. This argument is called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's cosmological because it has to do with the universe, and it's called kalam because this is an Arabic word that has to do with truth. And so this argument is very popular even from Islamic theology and other places. This is the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now let me ask you listeners, does that make sense to you? Well, it seems to me to be much more plausible than any other opposite idea. Now, why should we think that whatever begins to exist has a cause? Well, I can give you 2 solid reasons. Number 1, our common experience. Our common experience hundreds of times a day and millions of times throughout the course of our lives, our common experience shows us that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Chairs have a cause for beginning to exist. People have a cause for beginning to exist, as do dogs and cars and pencils and apples. Whatever begins to exist has a cause is probably one of the most reliable things, Nellis, that we see in our common experience. But not just our common experience, there's a law of logic that also says the very same thing. And listeners, you want to remember this, it's called the law of causality. Now, this law of logic, Nellis, called the law of causality, can be stated in different ways. You could say every effect has a cause. Or you could also say that everything that comes to be is caused by another. Or you could also just simply say that non-being cannot cause being. This idea of whatever begins to exist has a cause is actually a law of logic. Out of nothing comes nothing, and whatever begins to exist does have a cause. So it seems that that first principle is a lot more easy to believe, Nellis, than any other idea. The only other thing that we could believe is that things could begin to exist uncaused, and that doesn't seem to make very much sense, does it?
Definitely not. Just a quick note, my 7-year-old son, he memorized the whole Kalam cosmological argument. He memorized these 19 words. So I encourage our listeners, if my 7-year-old boy Hendrik remembers that, I'm sure you guys can also remember that argument.
Absolutely, that's a good encouragement. So there we go. Principle number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. We know that's true from our common experience and the law of causality. That would take us to step number 2, the universe began to exist. This is one of the reasons why this Kalam cosmological argument is so powerful and useful in today's society, because it is supported by science. Many times Christians mistakenly think that science is opposed to faith, that science is the enemy of Christianity, or that it's contradictory to Christianity, and this simply is not the case. The Kalam cosmological argument is supported by at least 5 different lines of science. So, really do encourage you, our listeners, to understand how powerful this argument is because we live in a scientific culture. And this could be one of the best tools that you could reach into your toolkit and use if you talk to someone who's into science. So, how do we know that the universe began to exist? How can we support that second step of the argument? Well, listeners, if you can remember the word fresh, FRESH, that can help you remember the fact that the universe began to exist, demonstratable by science. The F is for famous equations. We know the universe began to exist because there's 2 famous equations that have proven that to us mathematically. The first one is E equals mc squared. You probably remember this equation from a famous German gentleman with crazy white hair named Albert Einstein. And one of the many things that E equals mc squared proves to us is that the universe began to exist at a definite moment in time. Albert Einstein himself, he thought that the universe was eternal. He liked that, but unfortunately it wasn't the case. E equals mc squared demonstrates definitively that the universe began to exist. There's another equation you may not know too much about. It's called the Born, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem, or just the BGV theorem. In 2003, Arvin Born, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin came up with this theory, and it proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that any universe that's expanding on average over the course of its history must have a beginning. Even the multiverse, if it exists, and I don't think that it does, but if it did, the BGV theorem proves that it also had a beginning. So the first step of these famous equations is E equals mc squared, and the BGV theorem prove the universe began to exist. The next letter in fresh is R for ripples of matter and heat. In 1980, the COBE satellite was launched, and the COBE satellite predicted that they should discover specific ripples of heat and matter in deep space if the universe had a cosmic beginning, as the Big Bang said it did. And lo and behold, it discovered exactly what it predicted. Absolutely enormous and incredible ripples of heat and deep space matter, just as their theories predicted. Yet another scientific confirmation that the universe began to exist. Moving on to the E in fresh, that's for the expanding universe. In 1929, Edwin Hubble, he discovered in the Mount Wilson Observatory that the universe was expanding away from a point of common origin. The light that Edwin Hubble observed in 1929 was redshifted, and this proved that the distant galaxies giving off their light were spreading apart from each other at amazing speeds. In 1929, Edwin Hubble discovered the universe was indeed expanding. And so yet another scientific confirmation of the universe's beginning. If it's expanding away, as in a movie, simply pause it and play it in reverse, and it would come down to a point of beginning. And so this expansion of the universe also demonstrates the universe began to exist. The S in the acronym FRESH is for the second law. The second law of thermodynamics, Nellis, is the fact that the amount of available energy in the universe, which we can use for work, is running down. Things are going from a state of order to disorder, from a state of organization to disorganization. And this is known as the second law of thermodynamics, also called entropy. The reason this shows us the universe had a beginning is if the universe had been here for an eternity, all of the usable energy would have already vanished. It'd be like thinking that your car is low on gas. If your car engine has been running for eternity, you'd already be out of gas. But the fact that you have a certain amount of gas left, it proves that it's only been running for a certain amount of time. In the same way, we have usable energy still left in the universe, and so we know that we haven't been here for an infinite amount of time, but rather we had a beginning, and that energy is running down. And finally, the H in this acronym FRESH is for heat echo. In 1965, Arno Penzias and Bruce Wilson from the Bell Labs in New Jersey discovered the remnant heat echo of the cosmic beginning of our universe. This is kind of the smoking gun of the beginning of our universe, and this was discovered, as I said, in 1965 by Arno Penzias and Bruce Wilson, and they won the Nobel Prize for discovering this heat echo of the beginning of our universe. So friends, remember that word fresh. Famous equations, the ripples of deep space matter and heat, the expanding universe, the second law, and the heat echo. Nellis, that's very powerful scientific evidence that the universe began to exist.
That should be really encouraging for our listeners to know that we can use science for our faith in Christ, for our belief in a God that does exist. We're using scientific method, we're using science to help our belief. Now, Pastor Jason, what is the third conclusion of these first two premises?
Well, as you said, Nellis, step number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. And so the conclusion that follows is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And so by simply remembering these 19 words and thinking them through systematically, we can discover the universe had a cause for its existence, for its beginning. And listeners, you have to simply ask yourself, if there is a cause of the universe, what would that cause have to be like? Well, this is very simple. If the cause of the universe, and by that we mean all time, space, matter, and energy, if it caused all material, it would have to be immaterial. If this cause created all time, it would have to be timeless. If this cause created all space, it would be spaceless. And if this cause created all the energy, it would have to be enormously powerful. If this cause began the universe, it would have to be a personal cause. And so by simply analyzing the kind of features that this cause would have to have, we discover that it is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, unimaginably powerful, transcendent, personal cause of the universe. And that is exactly what we mean when we use the word God. Incredibly enough, Nellis, these are some of the very same attributes and qualities that the God of Scripture possesses. And this is why I love these arguments for God's existence. We worship the God that is shown to us in the Word, but we also worship the God that is shown to us in the world around us. So listeners, encourage you to remember those 19 words. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We know that from our common experience and from the law of causality. Number two, the universe began to exist. We know that from science. The famous equations, the ripples of deep space, matter, and heat, the expanding universe, the second law, and the heat echo. And step number three, the conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. And if we think about the qualities that cause would have to possess, we understand he's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, immensely powerful, transcendent from the universe, and is personal. Encourage you to remember these 19 words of the Kalam cosmological argument, and they can be a huge blessing to you.